On this episode of the Resilient Advisor podcast, I interview Celeste Blackman. Celeste is an expert at helping individuals, teams, and firms drive a higher level of collaboration inside of their organization and professional relationships. We discuss how financial advisors could leverage her framework of green zone cultures and red zone cultures to help drive better client outcomes. And at the end, we talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, and that is emotional intelligence. I hope you enjoy this podcast. Thanks for downloading this episode of the Resilient Advisor podcast. My name is Jay Coulter. A good friend of mine and professional colleague, Ken Myrick, first mentioned the name Celeste Blackman to me about 6 months ago. He suggested that I reach out to her and have her on the show, and I was hesitant because I had never heard of Celeste. And then I kept running into people who said, "Hey, Jay, do you know Celeste Blackman? Yeah, I ought to try to get her on the show." So finally, I asked Ken for an introduction, and Celeste has agreed to come on the show, and I'm always curious to interview somebody who has so many raving fans. Celeste is an international consultant and co-founder of the Green Zone Culture Group. She has taught communications in the Executive MBA program at the Wharton School of Business for more than 15 years, and she's worked with companies such as Chevron. She's worked with the United Nations, NASA, National Institutes of Health, and the National Cancer Institute. Celeste, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Jay. That's a lovely introduction.
Yeah, I've had guests say in the past, "Hey, I wish you could just walk around and introduce me, Jay."
I'm all for that. I love that.
There might be some money in it. All right, so let's dig into your work because I'm really curious about these raving fans you have. And in prepping for this interview, one thing I found that you had said that you're committed to helping people who want to build better relationships. This audience is predominantly financial advisors whose livelihood is built around relationships. And I know that's the path we're headed down in this interview, but let's start with the basics. What is a green zone?
A green zone refers to the environment that we create when we're interacting with one another, that we actually create an energetic field together. And when we're in the green zone, that energetic field is characterized by safety, trust, and caring, which turns out to be the space that really invites people to feel safe and comfortable and a place where we can begin to create trust.
Could you give me an example, and specifically an example of how a financial advisor might do that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, one of the primary roles for a financial advisor and concerns for a financial advisor is about the quality of the relationship that they have with their clients, which I'm actually suggesting we reframe to their partners, that they partner with these clients in order to create better outcomes. And that means being able to have really open dialogue and communication, which is reliant upon the success of that communication really is reliant upon the client and partner feeling safe and comfortable. And that means we're talking about both the content of the conversation, which for financial advisors is often about money, but it's also about the values, the goals, the feeling, the desires, wants, needs, and fears. And if a client or partner doesn't feel comfortable in my presence, they won't talk about those things. And I can't possibly develop the type of relationship that allows me to serve as deeply and as well and as successfully and long term unless I know those things. So I really need to create the kind of environment that invites people to feel safe and trusted, in my terms, significant, competent, and likable.
I'd like to take that down two paths. And this is, again, goes specifically to a financial advisor. One, how can they create that if they're just starting the relationship? And then let's follow that up with how they could implement that in an existing relationship, and keeping in mind that most advisors are they tend to lean towards the type A side and very direct in their communication style. So first, let's start off with a new relationship. You just met the person. How can you create that type of environment?
Yeah. So going first, being really clear and upfront about your intentions. What is it that you want to do? What's important to you? Asking lots of questions and being curious. Oftentimes in a new relationship, people aren't quite sure yet how much they trust you. So slowing things down becomes really important. Often we get a little carried away because we have our own idea or we can see the pathway, but we need to slow down long enough to help somebody else join us on the journey. So slowing down, going first, stating intention clearly, being curious and asking lots of questions so that you can understand more about where they are before you start sharing too much. But then being willing also to be transparent and share openly and honestly about yourself. Being willing to be a little vulnerable is one of the fastest pathways to creating trust and connection.
Well, how would an advisor do that on the front end?
By the vulnerable part might be sharing individual preferences about myself, about how I work, not waiting to be asked, perhaps sharing a time when I made a mistake or I faltered or didn't do things quite perfectly, but what I learned from that as a result.
Okay. And you used the term going first a couple of times. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, oftentimes we're a little hesitant in new relationships. Turns out we're all just a little bit afraid of one another. We're social animals. We have a social brain. We long to belong and get along. But when in a new relationship or a new situation, we're often just a little uncertain about the other person. So often we'll hesitate and we'll wait for somebody else to make the first move, to say the first thing, which is actually a little vulnerable also, to be willing to be clear and upfront about my intentions. Or it might be something like, I'm really interested in getting to know you and understanding a little bit more about what's important to you in your financial interests. Or I'm really interested in getting to know you and know about your family and how I might be able to serve you. So it's really taking that first step and being the first to open up and say something. In some situations, it's just going first in a networking situation where you approach. Often we stand around staring at each other in uncomfortable circumstances and situations, and nobody goes first. So going first can be really small steps, but it's being willing to take that first initiative.
Yeah. Hey, that makes perfect sense. And I got to tell you, I believe that there is a generation of advisors coming up. These are newer advisors that don't have the sales training, for lack of a better word, it used to be an advisor came into this industry, they sat in a bullpen for a number of years making cold calls and they learned how to sell. Those programs aren't around anymore. Those advisors aren't around anymore. And the skills needed to build relationships have changed. In the mid-'90s, I could sit in a bullpen and cold call people and get them to open an account, and they didn't even know who I was. That's just the way the markets worked. With today, it seems like the soft skills are so much more important, and that seems to be the path you're trying to take these advisors down as it relates to new relationships. Is that fair, or do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's really fair. And I think it is, the relationship value has changed tremendously, in part because we have a much more sophisticated clientele. People want more information. They want to be more engaged in the decision-making process. They don't want someone to tell and sell to them. They want someone to engage and coach with them. And that's why I think the partnership model is so important. And it's a more diverse audience, too. There was a time when primarily you were talking to men, and generally older men. Now we're talking about an audience that is made up largely of women, younger people coming in, both on the advisor side and the client side. So that changes the dynamic of the relationship tremendously.
All right. Well, hey, that's a great opportunity then to pivot, right? So what we have today is different, but there is a set of advisors out there that are dealing with the older male baby boomer clients.
Yeah.
And if they wanted to go and start implementing some of these concepts, it's a paradigm shift for them. How could they do it? And do you have any success stories around that or best practices?
Yeah. Let me say something about the science behind all of this, because one of the things that I like to say is how you do anything is how you do everything. And yes, there's a lot of things that are changing in the environment and the need for expanding these relationships. But there are also a lot of things that are very much the same. The model of human beings and how we build trust is very much the same. It turns out basically it's all biology. When we interact with one another, we engage a whole system of chemical responses that basically determine how we feel in one another's presence. And biology teaches us that if we want to influence behavior, we need to pay attention to those feelings. That irrespective of whether the client is male or female or old or young, feelings drive decision-making and action. So behavior impacts the decisions of our clients, and our capacity to communicate with them in ways that encourage them and motivate them and build trust is what we're really looking at. Would it be okay if I share a little bit about what I see in terms of the attitudes and the mindset that make a difference there?
I think that would really help drive home the point. Please do.
Terrific, because this is what we see in our work, that we see a range of attitudes. On one end of the spectrum is what we call a red zone. This is a fear-based attitude and is animated by a mindset that's adversarial, seeking to fight, protect, and defend. It's characterized by short-term thinking and a desire to beat the other side, to be right, to get as much for yourself as possible. And it often leads to communication that's argumentative, defensive, blaming, rigid, and threatening. This kind of communication sends the message or the signal to the receiver that it's a threat. And sensing a threat, the brain produces cortisol and adrenaline, chemicals associated with the negative brain state. And this kind of communication from the red zone usually generates a response in others that triggers fear and uncertainty, which is not a place where we can usually build trust and connection. And it's driven really by the fear of me trying to get what I want, trying to get my needs met, and not paying attention enough, not being curious enough about you and your needs. It's like trying to close the sale without really being clear on what the client wants. And that signal causes the client to close down, to try to protect and defend themselves. It's really not a place where we can do much partnering. On the other end of the spectrum is the green zone. And this is a trust-based attitude that's accompanied by a cooperative mindset, a mindset that seeks to collaborate, investigate, and connect. It's characterized by long-term thinking and a desire for mutual success, for understanding and partnership building. And it leads to communication that's curious, relaxed, accountable, clear, solution-oriented. It leads to more creative problem solving and deeper levels of understanding that in turn create trust and deepen our connection with one another. This is what really allows us to cultivate more of a partnership. So the benefit of really getting into a green zone with clients is biological. It's in this environment that the brain is bathed in feel-good chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. These are chemicals associated with a positive brain state and turn out to be the precursor for trust and the key to long-term relationships and effective problem solving. And my experience in working with advisors in a variety of professional settings is really that communication is the primary tool that we have for creating these kinds of environments. And so getting clear about your own mindset and attitude requires some self-reflection on the part of the advisor. So how do I build that mindset and build that attitude so that when I step into these interactions, whether it's a new client that I'm cultivating a relationship with or a client that I already have built a relationship with and want to continue deepening and strengthening because I know that changes are constantly coming.
So green zone, red zone, is there anything in the middle?
Funny you should ask. Yes, there is. We basically have three attitudes generally is what we work with and what we see. Mostly people have learned when they're triggered and have a fear that they have one of two options. that they can either attack or avoid. And we see that in communication all the time. The attack is about wanting to be right and going after someone, which is red. But the other color of that, which is just a little different shade, is the pink zone. And the pink zone is actually an avoidant attitude. It also, like the red zone, is fear-based. But the avoidant is much more about hiding, quitting, passively resisting. That mindset is really about trying to not engage. It fears conflict. And so often doesn't speak up, doesn't say much, doesn't share, isn't willing to show much of oneself. And so that also undermines trust and keeps us from being able to connect with one another. And that one can sometimes be a little bit hard to detect because it can appear as being nice, as being cordial, as being polite. But it doesn't have much energy and it doesn't have much engagement. We don't get much resolved when we're in the pink zone. And it's probably what I see most predominantly in organizations and in interactions, the dynamic between people and their communication.
Let's take a step back from the financial advisor and talk about this concept through the lens of the firm. So most of my clients, and I think most of the listeners of this podcast, work at independent firms where they have the opportunity to create their own culture. I mean, it's already there. They could obviously change it if possible, but most folks grew up in red zone cultures professionally. They sat in the bullpens at Dean Witter and Merrill Lynch and Smith Barney, and they were driven by fear. If you don't hit production numbers, you're going to lose your job, or fear with clients. If you don't deliver performance results, you're going to lose the business. And now they're owners of businesses and they have the opportunity to create cultures. How do you guide smaller organizations to create that green zone culture that you talk about?
Yeah. So that's such an exciting opportunity because people really can have an impact, a positive impact. And the key is to be deliberate. You're going to create an environment, a culture, if you will, either by design or by default. And my experience is that most people step in and just allow things to happen and it sort of unfolds by default. So the key is to get really, really clear about your own values, what's important, and then design the kind of culture that you want. And the key becomes, are you modeling it? Do you know what your values are? Do you know what's important? What is it that you want to create? And then how do your actions, how do your behaviors signal and convey that to everyone else in the firm? How do you hold yourself accountable? How do you openly share that? So that you're the role model for it.
So does that fit into the camp of lead by example and drive it from the top?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then encouraging it by, when you see it, appreciating it, acknowledging it, rewarding the behaviors that you want to see. You know, we're training each other every day, in every moment, in every interaction that we have. When we allow things to pass by that aren't acceptable and we don't say anything, we don't open up, we don't talk about it, basically what we're saying is it's okay for you to behave that way.
Well, Celeste...
So in this model...
No, please.
I was going to say, in this model, one of the things that we think is really important is that we talk about it, but we do it in a way that's very accountable, so that it's not a shaming or blaming model. It's about being really open and sharing what works, being assertive but not aggressive, being cooperative, mutually supportive, and inviting people to really feel that what they have to offer is important to the firm and that they can learn and grow.
Okay. Before I ask my final question, Celeste, is there anything else about green zone cultures that you'd like listeners to know?
That I think that they are good for the brain, they're good for the body, and they're good for the bottom line. So we don't encourage these kinds of environments just because it would be nice. Not that I have a problem with nice. I like working in nice. But we encourage them because they make a difference. They make a difference in how people feel and how they behave and the productivity and engagement they have with clients.
Excellent. Now, I didn't tell you I was going to ask you about this question by design, So I know that you are certified in the Bar-On Emotional Intelligence program. I am a huge believer in the emotional intelligence concept. It's helped me really drive a lot of personal change and change with clients. It sometimes can be a little heady and esoteric, which is hard to deliver with some of the personality types in this space. Could you talk a little bit about the power of emotional intelligence for anyone, not just financial advisors, and how it could fundamentally change the way they work with people and in their personal and professional lives?
Absolutely. So emotional intelligence is the key to motivating behavior and connection with one another. You see, we like to think that we're thinking rational creatures, when in reality, everything that we do is driven at a deeper level by emotions and feelings. And so if you really want to impact behavior, you have to understand that what you're really attaching to is the feeling state of people. And so when I talk about emotional intelligence, I combine both emotional and social intelligence together because they are connected inextricably. And when we're interacting with one another, we're using our emotional intelligence and our social intelligence to create a feeling state. Because what it turns out that how people feel in your presence makes a difference. And it turns out that I trust you, I like you, I want to do business with you because I feel good in your presence. And the real kicker, I think, is that I like you and trust you not because you're so smart, not because you're the top advisor, not because you graduated at the top of your class, but I like you and trust you because in your presence, I like and trust myself. And that turns out to be an emotional connection.
And then how about from the angle of self-reflection? So, for example, I have found once I started studying emotional intelligence, I was able to, quite frankly, change the way I behaved around people, more in particularly when they frustrated me or were not meeting my expectations. I was able to have more empathy to the situation and in the end of the day, get better results out of it.
Yeah. So it's almost the opposite of what you think, right? And what we're trained for. We think if we push harder, really push people, that somehow things are going to be better and that it's all about them. And really what you're talking about is the key. It's the way through, which is self-reflection. All of it, collaboration starts inside the individual. My capacity to really connect and partner with you is driven by my own internal mindset, attitude, the way that I show up, and how compassionate and empathetic I am. Those skills can only be developed when I become more self-aware. So a key strategy for doing that is the ability to step back from time to time. I like to call it going to the balcony. I go to the balcony to take a look at, get a bigger perspective of what's actually going on stage so that I can see other people's perspectives, their attitudes, how they interact with one another, and get a better glimpse of how my behaviors and attitudes are impacting everyone else. And from that perspective, I can then begin to make adjustments. If I don't get defensive, if I don't go red or pink on myself, I can begin to adjust my own attitude and get curious instead of being furious if I'm not being successful. So that's one of the ways that we shut ourselves down to learning and growing ourselves, is that we don't like the parts of ourselves that aren't working well. So we try to ignore them or push them away or attack them instead of getting curious about, isn't that interesting that created that kind of response? That person got angry when I said that, or didn't want to follow my instruction, or I wasn't able to influence them. But if I don't get angry or upset about my inability to do that and instead get curious, I can take a step back and reflect on how I might do that differently. And if I'm really brave, I might ask for some feedback from some trusted people, colleagues and advisors, who might be willing to share how they see me and how they experience me. And then I can take that feedback and my own self-reflection and begin to try some experiments to see how I might be even more effective and make small steps to creating a more effective approach toward dealing with others and becoming more of the person that I really want to be. And that's emotional intelligence.
Getting curious instead of furious. Celeste,
Yes.
I love it. Thanks so much for coming on. Would you please tell listeners how they could find out more about you and your work?
Absolutely. You can find out more about me at the Green Zone Culture Group website, which is greenzoneculture.com. If you're a female advisor and want to focus particularly on some skills aimed towards women, you might check out the radicalcollaborationforwomen.com. I have a workshop coming up in June. And also the radicalcollaboration.com workshop. All three of those sites have information about me, my work, and my partners.
Excellent. I will have all of that in the show notes. Celeste, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jay. I really enjoyed it.